Tonight on Primetime Politics, standing with Ukraine.
We will continue to stand with Ukraine until the war is over and until Ukraine wins.
The Prime Minister travels to Ukraine, joining European leaders to mark 3 years since Russia's illegal invasion began, showing solidarity in Kyiv as U.S. support wavers. Coming up, we'll examine the importance of this visit as we sit down with the President of the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress. Also, as Donald Trump adopts the language of Russian disinformation, we'll look at the pushback the U.S. President is receiving in the U.S. Capitol. Plus, setting up the first Liberal leadership debate set to take place tonight in Montreal. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. The Ukrainian capital was the site of a remarkable demonstration of solidarity today. 13 world leaders, the Prime Minister among them, traveling to Kyiv to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. 3 years ago today, Russia launched its illegal invasion of Ukraine, but the gathering was more than just marking today's anniversary. It was also a show of force against Russia and the United States, as Donald Trump in recent days has adopted the language of Russian disinformation and blamed Kyiv for the deadly war. Take a listen to what we heard today from Justin Trudeau.
We also believe deeply that it's not just about Ukraine. It's about the rules and the values and the principles of sovereignty, of independence, of territorial integrity that protects every country in the world. And we know we're going to have to continue to do more and more in an uncertain world, and Canada will be there. As to how we will be there, we will work with our neighbors on it, but everything is on the table because we need to make sure that might no longer makes right in this world.
In addition to those words, the Prime Minister also made more tangible commitments to Ukraine today. They include 25 additional light armored vehicles, 2 armored combat support vehicles, F-16 flight simulators, and $5 billion in revenues taken from frozen Russian assets. Much needed pledges as the Trump administration signals it will no longer support Ukraine as the U.S. did in the past, and as the United States joined Russia today at the United Nations, voting against a European resolution condemning Moscow for the war and rejecting a call on Russia to return Ukrainian territory that it seized. Alexandra Chyczij is the president of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. She joins us right now from Toronto. Ms. Chyczij, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Listen, given the policy direction that we have seen from the Trump administration this past week, this change of policy direction, if you will, what does it mean to you to see the Prime Minister, along with other world leaders, gathered in Kyiv to support the Ukrainian cause?
We are incredibly grateful that our Prime Minister has joined EU leaders and the UK to demonstrate so visibly and meaningfully their ongoing support for Ukraine. The abandonment of the United States, not only of Ukraine, but the undermining of the NATO alliance and the UN is difficult to see, and I think it's a moral stain on the United States.
Do you feel as if the United States has changed direction and there's no turning its course back to what it was?
Well, I think we can hope that the American people will wake up and begin to protest loudly through their congressmen and women their disappointment with what their president is doing. I mean, we know that not all Americans supported President Trump in the election. And it reminds me, honestly and terrifyingly, of fascist Germany. You know, we all know the famous quote, "And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me." And it's this apparent capitulation of the American people in bowing and cowering before a president who is bent on destroying not only their way of life, but the international world order.
International world order, which we've heard time and again ever since Russia began its illegal invasion 3 years ago. You know, Donald Trump did take to social media today, and in addressing the meeting in Kyiv today, he talked about securing a critical minerals deal with Ukraine to help get back some of the money the United States has spent in support of Ukrainian defense. And he goes on to say, and this is again from his media post, he says, I am in serious discussion with President Vladimir Putin of Russia concerning the ending of the war and also major economic development transactions which will take place between the United States and Russia. Talks are proceeding very well. Underline that word, major economic development transactions. What do you take from that public declaration, clearly touting something that's going to come down the pipes with Russia rather than securing Ukrainian victory?
Well, he's made a deal with Putin. That is clear. I mean, we already know that he has probably been negotiating with Putin over Ukraine's rare earth minerals that are located in the territories that are being occupied by Russia today. So at the same time that he's blackmailing Zelensky into accepting a deal that Zelensky has thankfully said he's not going to accept because it will mean generations of Ukrainians paying for it, and there's no security guarantee in it. He has made the same deal with Putin, and likely for gas and oil at bargain basement prices. I mean, this is a man who is completely transactional.
Transactional, as you say. So where does this leave Ukraine, though? Because if Donald Trump and his administration is, as you say, transactional, compare that to the previous administration, which had this, which was holding up this ideal of a democratic country fighting for its democratic survival. Where does this leave Ukraine then, if the United States sides with the Kremlin and not Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine has no choice but to rely on the EU, the UK, and Canada. And thankfully, they are there today demonstrating that support. We know that the combined GDP of Europe is certainly sufficient to match the aid that was provided, the military aid that was provided previously by the United States. And that is who Ukraine has to put their faith in. And of course, Canada is well advised to be part of that alliance because we have been threatened by a NATO neighbor. Trump calling us the 51st state is a direct threat to our sovereignty. And of course, threatening to take over Greenland is a threat to Denmark. This is unheard of that one NATO member is threatening other NATO countries.
Now, Canada did, as we said, leading into, has made several new commitments today in its meeting in Kyiv. What do you want to see from Canada going forward? Beyond the commitments made today, where would you like to see this country go forward? If the United States is wavering in their support, what do you think the priority needs to be for Canada?
I think it needs to be in Canada building up its defense industry. Canada needs to defend itself. I don't think we should take for granted that Trump wouldn't resort to something more than economic pressure. I used to worry about a Russian or a Chinese submarine surfacing in James Bay. Now it could just as well be an American submarine. We cannot rely on the Americans to defend us or defend our North. We must do that ourselves. And we must do it with reliable partners like the EU and the UK. It's in our self-interest to do that.
You know, I think what's interesting about the discussion this past week is when you hear it from officials in negotiations, they talk about things like critical minerals, they talk about armament, they talk about financial funding. But Ukrainians certainly have a far more intimate picture because they know this has been about people and people losing lives on the ground in Ukraine. Where does your thought go to right now about the Ukrainian people? Are you scared for them? Are you discouraged for them? How are you feeling right now?
Initially, I was frightened and very sad. Certainly, people in Ukraine are aghast at the betrayal of the United States of America, in whom they placed their trust. But Ukrainians are resilient. We can't forget that everyone, including the Western allies, wrote them off they gave them 3 days to survive the Russian assault. And here we are 3 years later, still standing. I believe that Europe, the UK and Canada will stand with Ukraine, and that Ukraine will prevail.
Alexandra, I appreciate the time this evening. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Michael.
Now, while President Zelensky hosted Canada and the other 12 European leaders in Kyiv, in Washington, the U.S. president hosted the French President Emmanuel Macron. And when pressed about his talks with Russia, well, this is what we heard from Donald Trump.
There's tremendous distrust on both sides. That's why it's good that I'm coming in now. But I think it's to the very much benefit of Russia to make a deal and to go on with leading Russia in a very positive way. That's what you have to do. But I really believe that he wants to make a deal. Maybe wrong, but I believe he wants to make a deal.
Well, Laura Kelly is the foreign policy reporter for The Hill in Washington. In addition to her reports from D.C., she's also reported from a number of different conflict zones, including Ukraine. Laura, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, Donald Trump's declarations about Ukraine and really adopting these Russian talking points when it comes to assigning blame for the war, what's been the reaction to that in D.C.?
I think when President Trump first came out with some of these really remarkable statements that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator without elections, or that Ukraine started the war, the reaction on Capitol Hill among Republicans in particular was surprising, because it did show a break with the president on that front. We had some senators who are generally okay to buck the president at times. Senator Collins from Maine, she was very critical of President Trump's remarks. Senator Tom Tillis had actually just returned from a trip to Ukraine when President Trump made these remarks, and he came out against them. But we also saw some people who are not very critical of the president ever being a little bit critical, walking a fine line to not be criticizing the president outright, but stating their opinion that they believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin is the aggressor in this war. He invaded Ukraine without provocation, and he is a war criminal. This includes Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana. And Senate Majority Leader John Thune, he also came out kind of walking this line, not criticizing the president, not saying the president speaks for himself, but saying that he believes that he wants to give the president space to go for a peaceful outcome in Ukraine. So those are some of the initial remarks. Also, I'll just add Senator Wicker. He's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he had some pretty strong comments that Putin deserves to be executed, I believe he said.
Okay, so strong commentary there, but you list out some names there: Collins, Thune, Kennedy, Tillis. Is that the full list of allies that Ukraine has in D.C., or does Ukraine's allyship, does that run deeper in the U.S. Capitol than perhaps is obvious right now?
In the Senate, I believe that Ukraine does have a core majority group of bipartisan support among Republicans, and for Republicans, they are straddling this line between not breaking with President Trump, but also reinforcing that they support Ukraine and they want to see Ukraine come out of this with the security that it needs to deter any future Russian aggression. I mean, one of those allies is Senator Lindsey Graham. He's someone that really is said to have the ear of President Trump. I would say, anything can happen at any time of the day. So it's not entirely certain where Lindsey Graham falls on the favorability spectrum in the moment. But Senator Graham was really the person that pushed forward this idea that Ukraine and the U.S. should sign a contract on Ukraine's rare earth metals and critical minerals and things like that, and use that as a way to get President Trump invested in making sure that Ukraine is secure and prosperous. So that's an example of where Ukraine still has Republican allies that are fighting to this day to make sure it gets a good deal in any negotiation with Russia.
Okay, let's pick up on that point then, because, of course, critical minerals has, in the last week in particular, has taken on this greater focus in terms of trying to find a pathway forward for both Ukraine and the United States. Ukraine would like to see access to its critical minerals backstopped with security guarantees. Is the White House open to that, or do they just view the minerals as a way of paying back Americans for money that's been invested in Ukraine's defense?
Yes, negotiations are ongoing with what that deal would actually look like, but President Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said just in the Oval Office a few minutes ago that they are at the 1 yard line in agreeing to the terms of this deal. So I'm not entirely certain what are the parameters of the deal, but it would stand to reason that any agreement where if the U.S. is investing and has economic infrastructure, mines or things like that, or just has money on the table wanting to get the profits from these critical minerals, that it would want to protect its investment. Now, initially, the argument was that the fact that U.S. dollars are on the table is a security guarantee in itself, because Russia wouldn't want to make some sort of aggression that would trigger a blowback from the United States. But Ukraine's criticism was that there were American companies operating in Ukraine when Putin decided to launch the full-scale invasion. So that is not a deterrent enough. So then it's looking at all these other ways that security can be guaranteed for Ukraine.
Now, we know that Donald Trump is very intent on the war ending in Ukraine. What's the timeline that he's looking at now? Because there was, in the course of the campaign, these declarations of ending the war day one. Much harder to do when you're faced with the reality of it. What timeline is Donald Trump looking at now? And does that timeline respect Ukrainian points of view on it?
Yes, I think what we've seen is definitely that timeline extending from 1 day to then we heard about maybe 100 days. And honestly, I believe that even if there is a certain timeline, a certain line in the sand, that doesn't necessarily mean that the conflict is over. Because if you do sign an agreement, if you do have a peace, some sort of ceasefire, peace settlement, it's going to have to be monitored. It's going to have to go through these different phases. I don't think it can be viewed as cut and dry. But President Trump has shown that he wants things to move quickly. He wants to see some sort of progress immediately. And that's why I think there have been this outreach to the Russians, this meeting in Saudi Arabia between Trump's officials and Russian officials, and talks about a possible summit between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin as signals, as ways to show tangible progress, even if those kind of things don't actually move forward on specific deals.
So the optics and looking like progress is being made ahead of the details, I guess a fair way of saying it.
Yes.
Okay. Laura, always appreciate the insight. Thank you for that. Laura Kelly in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for having me.
And one more note on Donald Trump tonight. Earlier, as the U.S. president held a news conference with Emmanuel Macron, he was asked about the tariff threats he's made against both Mexico and Canada. And despite the appointment of a fentanyl czar in this country and the promises made to secure the Canada-U.S. border, well, Donald Trump says the tariffs will still be moving ahead.
The tariffs are going forward on time, on schedule. This is an abuse that took place for many, many years. And I'm not even blaming the other countries that did this. I blame our leadership for allowing it to happen. I mean, who can blame them if they made these great deals with the United States, took advantage of the United States on manufacturing, on just about everything. Every aspect that you could imagine they took advantage of. I look at some of these agreements, I'd read them at night, and I'd say, who would ever sign a thing like this? So the tariffs will go forward.
Well, let's turn now to the Liberal leadership race because in less than 2 weeks' time, party members will choose Justin Trudeau's successor, not just as leader, but also prime minister. And tonight, the four people vying for that job will take part in the first of two debates in Montreal. Tonight's debate will be in French. And to talk about this, we're now joined by Catherine Lévesque, parliamentary reporter for the National Post, and in Montreal, Kyle Duggan of the Canadian Press. Hello to both of you.
Good evening.
So listen, Catherine, we're going to begin with you here because, you know, this debate in Quebec, there seems to be so much more pressure on Mark Carney. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, you know, recently there was that poll from Leger and it showed that nationally, if Mr. Carney took over the Liberal Party, it would be in a statistical tie with Conservatives. But in Quebec, if it was under Mark Carney, the Liberals could actually take over the BQ. Talk to us about how important tonight's debate is for Mr. Carney.
Oh, it's extremely important, and he's been, you know, really practicing his French for weeks. Already, you know, I've seen a difference between the start of the campaign, where his French was a little, you know, he had a little bit of difficulty, let's just say it like that. And today, in like recent interviews, you know, he's a lot more assured and he's a lot more confident in his French. So, look, and I'm told that, you know, his staff has been solely speaking to him in French in the last few days. So really, he wants to be fully prepared for this moment. I mean, the moment, what his challenge today is to really speak to Quebecers, to show who he is, right? Because I think a lot of Quebecers like the concept of Mark Carney. They kind of like the image of him, you know, the businessman, the banker, the person who can take on Donald Trump, but they don't know who he is yet. So, you know, what his team told me today is that they really want him to, yes, be assured, to speak in French, to convey his messages, but also to be, you know, funny and to you know, really show to Quebecers who he is, because really, like you said, I mean, you know, the Liberals' perspectives could actually double in Quebec. I mean, you know, I think he could really take on the bloc. So this is immensely important for him today, and really, he's got a lot to gain, but also a lot to lose tonight.
Yes, a lot on the line, as you say. Kyle, what would you say to that? Because he is, Mark Carney, the perceived front runner nationally, and in Quebec, he seems to be really moving numbers.
That's right. I mean, the big thing is Mark Carney's going to be on the defensive tonight. He's the perceived front runner, so he basically just has to show up, put on a good show, and not look comfortable, basically, and be able to clearly respond in French. A source of mine had pointed out that his French was actually much better when he was at the governor of the Bank of Canada about a decade ago. So he's become a bit rusty. So as Catherine said, he's been working on his French with his team over the campaign to improve that. I will be watching for how comfortable he looks and how scripted his lines are. Chrystia Freeland's team is trying very actively to show a warmer side of her. She is behind, perceived to be behind, and ironically kind of like the underdog of the race, even though she had precipitated this entire event. So it will be interesting to compare and contrast the two, and will any of the candidates decide to vigorously attack Mr. Carney, who is very clearly seen to be the front runner. And also, well, he is on the stage. I think a lot of people will be looking to see, all right, well, this is how he's doing in French against his Liberal colleagues. How would he fare against Pierre Poilievre or Yves-François Blanchet, who are both very good debaters in French, both very quick on their feet. So I think this will be a bit of a benchmark for Carney, and for Freeland and the rest. It's a bit of a crucial moment. Can they turn things around?
Yeah, can they turn things around? And, you know, let me pick up on that point, though, because, you know, Kyle kind of touched upon it. But, you know, here you have Mr. Carney, and as Kyle was saying, his sources say that he was better 10 years ago when he was the Bank of Canada governor, when he was operating in both official languages more frequently. But, you know, you have a field here in the top four. French is not their first language. So how is that going to factor in? How hard will they be judged by voters in Quebec based on their language skills?
I mean, I think I can speak as a Quebecer. I think Quebecers appreciate people who are making efforts, right? So, even though, in none of their cases it's their first language, even Frank Baylis, who is from Montreal, I think his parents are Anglo-Quebecers. I mean, I think they will be able to have some discussion and some debate. And look, I mean, Karina Gould is very good in French, Chrystia Freeland as well. I mean, they're also very used to, debates in the House of Commons, and, they're very quick on their feet, as Kyle said. So they're used to this, this hustle in the debate. Mark Carney, on the other hand, I mean, yes, not only is he rusty, and even if he's gotten a lot better in the last few weeks because he's practicing a lot more, I mean, he's never been a politician, right? So I don't know how well he's going to do in, responding to attacks or responding to his adversaries and, really getting his point across. So I think, yeah, it will be a challenge certainly for all of them, I think, compared to the English debate tomorrow, but certainly I think for Mr. Carney tonight.
Yeah, Mr. Carney tonight, and you're right. I mean, in either official language, the very fact that he's not been in the House Commons in and out there will be a judgment passed on him as to how quickly he can answer those questions and come up with a response. But Kyle, I'm wondering about we've been talking a lot about Mark Carney, but of the others here, Ms. Gould, Ms. Freeland, Mr. Baylis, has anyone else been able to capture the imagination in Quebec the way Mark Carney has?
Not in quite the same way. I mean, we've seen through all of the visible metrics put Carney ahead. He's ahead in the polling. He's ahead in the fundraising. His team was talking about their massive fundraising haul over the weekend. They've raised more than $3 million now. So, that's quite a lot for a short amount of time in a short race like this. On the other hand, Mr. Carney's also had a lot of time to prepare for all of this, so he will presumably be somewhat prepared for the debate. It's been clear that this leadership race was potentially in the offing for a long time now, so I suspect he's rehearsed for some time. In terms of the other candidates, I mean, Karina Gould really has surprised a lot of people at how well she has done. I can't speak to Quebec specifically, but within the party, I think a lot of people are really curious to see where she ends up after this. And Frank Baylis, his French is quite good, so this is maybe actually his moment to really try to grab some attention, say some interesting things, because he's had a bit of a difficulty breaking through in the media. So it'll be interesting to see them on stage, as Catherine was saying. Karina Gould, former House leader in the Commons, so she's used to going toe-to-toe with people and cut and thrust debate. But I don't know how aggressive this will be today and tomorrow. But it is a crucial moment for all of these people if they want to be seen to be leadership material.
Absolutely. Listen, I have less than a minute, so 30 seconds to each of you. Catherine, what are you watching out for tonight?
I'm watching for how Chrystia Freeland is going to break through and how she's going to capture the attention of Liberal voters, because she really needs this moment to shine right now.
Okay, Kyle, quickly to you.
I'm actually just mostly interested in how the press covers this in Quebec. I think how French language media decides to portray Mr. Carney will be really the important takeaway from tonight, not necessarily anything on the debate stage other than maybe their body language.
Okay, well, I know all three of us will be watching. Kyle Duggan in Montreal, Catherine Lévesque here with me in studio. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.